The door was slightly open. Nene stood in the quiet hallway, holding her backpack. She had just returned from the university earlier than expected. Her last lecture was canceled, so she decided to surprise her father. But her father was not home. He had traveled 2 days ago for a business meeting in Abuja. The house was strangely quiet. Too quiet. Nene slowly walked toward the living room. Then she heard something. A sound. A laugh. It was her stepmother's voice, Mrs. Funka. But there was another voice, too. A man's voice. Nene frowned. Who is that? She whispered to herself. Her heart began to beat faster. The voices were coming from her father's bedroom. She moved closer. Step by step, the closer she got, the clearer the voices became. Then she heard something that made her stop completely. A man laughed loudly. Mrs. Funky giggled. Nene's stomach twisted. Her father's bedroom door was not fully closed. It was slightly open, just enough to see inside. Nene slowly moved toward the small gap. She didn't know what she expected to see, but what she saw made her body freeze. Mrs. Funky was on the bed, and she was not alone. A strange man was with her. They were lying together, laughing, touching each other. On her father's bed, Nene covered her mouth quickly. Her eyes grew wide with shock. Impossible, she whispered silently. Her father trusted Mrs. Funky completely. After Nene's mother died 3 years ago, the house had been full of sadness. Mrs. Funke had been her mother's friend. She used to visit often. She cried with them. She comforted her father. She always said she wanted to help the family. 1 year later, she married her father. Everyone said it was fate. But Nene had always felt something strange about her, something she could never explain. Now she was seeing the truth with her own eyes. Nene slowly pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking. Inside the room, Mrs. Funky laughed again. The man said something Nene could not hear clearly. Nene carefully lifted her phone. She pressed the video button. The camera began recording. Her heart was beating loudly in her chest. She moved the phone closer to the door opening. The camera captured everything. The bed, the man, Mrs. Funka, her father's pillow, her father's room. Nene quickly took several pictures too. Click, click, click. Suddenly, the bed creaked loudly. Mrs. Funky stopped laughing. Nene's heart jumped. Inside the room, Mrs. Funky sat up slowly. Did you hear that? She asked. The man frowned. Hear what? He replied. Mrs. Funky looked toward the door. Nene's breathing stopped. The door began to move. Slowly, very slowly. Someone inside the room was walking toward it. Nene stood frozen in the hallway, her phone still recording. Then, suddenly, the door handle started turning and the door began to open. Nene had only 1 second to decide what to do. Her heart began to pound like a drum. For a second, she could not move. Then her body suddenly reacted. She stepped back quietly and slipped behind the wall beside the hallway. Just as she hid, the bedroom door opened. Mrs. Funky stood at the doorway. She looked left, then right. The hallway was empty. She frowned slightly. I thought I heard something, she said. Behind the wall, Nene pressed her back tightly against it. Her phone was still in her hand and the video was still recording. The strange man inside the room spoke. You worry too much, he said lazily from the bed. Mrs. Funky shook her head. This house is too quiet. It feels strange when Frank is not around. She looked down the hallway again. For a moment, Nene thought Mrs. Funky could hear her heartbeat. But after a few seconds, Mrs. Funky sighed and closed the door. Click. Nene released the breath she had been holding. Her legs felt weak. Slowly, she stopped the recording on her phone. Her hands were still shaking. "What did I just see?" she whispered. She looked at the phone screen. The video was clear, very clear. Mrs. Funka, the strange man, her father's bedroom, her father's bed. Nene's chest tightened. She remembered her father's face. Frank was a kind man. He worked hard every day. After Nene's mother died, he had been broken with grief. Mrs. Funky was the one who comforted him. She cried with him. She helped cook in the kitchen. She helped clean the house. Everyone said she was a good friend. But now Nene understood something terrible. Mrs. Funky did not come because she cared. She came because she wanted her father. And now she was cheating on him, right in his own house. Nene opened the video again and watched a few seconds. Her stomach twisted. She quickly stopped it. "This will break Daddy's heart," she whispered sadly. She leaned against the wall and thought carefully. If Mrs. Funky discovered that she had seen everything, there would be trouble. Big trouble. Mrs. Funky was clever. Too clever. Nene remembered the many times Mrs. Funky smiled sweetly in front of her father. But when her father was not around, her face always changed. Cold, sharp, unfriendly. Nene quietly walked toward the front door. She needed to leave before anyone saw her. But just as she reached the door, she heard voices again. Mrs. Funke and the man were talking inside the bedroom. The door inside had opened again. Their voices floated into the hallway. "Relax," the man said. "Your husband trusts you too much. He will never suspect anything." Mrs. Funky laughed softly. "Of course he trusts me," she replied proudly. "I planned everything perfectly. Frank believes I married him because I loved his late wife like a sister." The man chuckled. "But you never loved her." Mrs. Funke's voice turned cold. "I was always jealous of her life." Nene froze where she stood. Her stepmother continued speaking. "She had everything: the perfect husband, the beautiful house, the happy family." The man asked quietly, "So you decided to take it?" Mrs. Funky laughed again. "Yes, and I succeeded." Nene felt chills run through her body. Then Mrs. Funke said something that made Nene's eyes widen in shock. "Frank has no idea who he really married." Nene slowly turned back toward the hallway. Her phone tightened in her hand because she suddenly realized something terrifying. Mrs. Funke was hiding more secrets, much bigger secrets, and Nene had just started to uncover them. But at that exact moment, Nene heard footsteps coming toward the living room. Someone was leaving the bedroom, and they were walking straight toward her. The footsteps were getting closer. Nene's heart began to race again. She quickly looked around the living room. There was nowhere to hide. The front door was only a few steps away, but the person coming from the hallway would see her if she ran. The footsteps came closer. 1 step. 2 step. 3. Nene quickly slid behind the long curtain beside the window. She held the fabric tightly and prayed silently. "Please don't see me." The man walked into the living room. Nene could see his shadow through the thin curtain. He stretched his arms and yawned. "I should go before someone comes," he said loudly. From the hallway, Mrs. Funky answered, "Yes, it's safer that way." Nene carefully peeked through a tiny space in the curtain. The man was tall and dark. He wore a black shirt and jeans. He walked toward the front door. Nene held her breath. The man opened the door and stepped outside. The door closed. Click. For a moment, the house became quiet again. Nene slowly stepped out from behind the curtain. She hurried toward the door. But before she could reach it, Mrs. Funky suddenly appeared in the hallway. "Mean?" Nene froze. Her stepmother stared at her in surprise. "Nene, what are you doing here?" Mrs. Funky asked sharply. Nene forced a small smile. I I came home early, she said. Mrs. Funky's eyes narrowed. Early? Your classes finish late. They canceled the lecture today, Nene replied quickly. Mrs. Funky looked at her carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Funky walked closer. Her voice suddenly became sweet. Oh, I see. You should have called first. Nene nodded slowly. I just wanted to surprise Daddy. Mrs. Funky laughed softly. Your father is not home, remember? He is in Abuja. Yes, Nene said quietly. Mrs. Funky folded her arms. How long have you been home? She asked. Nene felt a cold wave run through her body. She knew that question was dangerous. If she answered wrongly, Mrs. Funky might suspect something. Not long, Nene replied carefully. I just arrived. Mrs. Funky studied her face. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp. Then suddenly, Mrs. Funky smiled again. Well, since you're here, go and rest in your room. Nene nodded. Okay. She began walking toward the staircase. But as she passed Mrs. Funky, she felt something strange. Her stepmother was watching her very closely, too closely, as if she was trying to read her mind. Nene quickly went upstairs to her room and closed the door. Her hands were shaking again. She sat on the bed and opened her phone. The evidence was still there. Videos, pictures, everything. Nene whispered to herself, Daddy needs to see this. But then another thought entered her mind. What if Mrs. Funka tried to delete the evidence? Or worse, what if she tried to stop Nene? Downstairs, Nene suddenly heard Mrs. Funke talking on the phone. Her voice was low but angry. Yes, Mrs. Funky whispered. She came home earlier than expected. Nene slowly moved closer to her bedroom door and listened carefully. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Funky said quietly, I think the girl may have seen something. Nene's eyes widened in fear. Then Mrs. Funky added something even more frightening. If she talks, we may have to deal with her. Nene's hand slowly covered her mouth because at that moment, she realized her life might be in serious danger. Nene's heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She slowly stepped away from the bedroom door. Her stepmother's words echoed again and again in her mind. If she talks, we may have to deal with her. Nene felt cold fear spread through her body. Deal with me? She whispered. Her hands began to shake. She quickly sat on the bed and looked at her phone again. The videos were still there. The pictures, too. Everything was clear. Everything was real. For a moment, Nene thought about deleting the files. Maybe it would make things easier. Maybe Mrs. Funky would stop being dangerous. But then she remembered her father, Frank, a kind man who trusted his wife completely. A man who believed Mrs. Funky loved him. Nene shook her head slowly. No, Daddy deserves to know the truth. She quickly backed up the videos and pictures to her email. Then she sent the files to another safe folder online. Now, even if she takes my phone, the evidence is safe, she said quietly. Downstairs, the house became quiet again. Mrs. Funky had stopped talking on the phone. Nene stayed inside her room for hours. She did not come downstairs. She did not make any noise. Finally, night came. The sky outside turned dark. Nene heard Mrs. Funke moving around the kitchen. Plates clinked. Water ran from the tap. Everything looked normal again. But Nene knew the truth. Her stepmother was pretending. 2 days later, Frank returned from his business trip. Nene was sitting in the living room when his car drove into the compound. She quickly stood up. Her heart was pounding again. Frank walked into the house with a tired smile. My daughter, he said happily. He hugged Nene warmly. I missed you. I missed you too, Daddy, Nene said softly. Mrs. Funke came from the kitchen with a bright smile. Welcome back, my dear, she said sweetly. Frank kissed her cheek. Thank you, Funky. They all sat together in the living room. For a few minutes, everything seemed peaceful. But Nene's chest felt heavy. She could not keep the secret any longer. Her father deserved the truth. Daddy, Nene said slowly. Frank looked at her. Yes, my dear? Nene swallowed. I need to tell you something important. Mrs. Funke immediately turned to look at her. Her eyes were sharp. What is it? Frank asked gently. Nene stood up slowly. Her hands were shaking. She took out her phone. Daddy, something happened while you were away. Mrs. Funky's face suddenly became tense. What are you talking about? She asked quickly. Nene did not answer her. She walked to her father and showed him the phone. Please watch this, she said quietly. Frank looked confused. He pressed play. The video began. At first, Frank did not understand what he was seeing. Then suddenly, his face changed. His eyes widened. His mouth slowly opened in shock. Mrs. Funky rushed forward. What is that? She demanded nervously. But it was too late. Frank had already seen everything. The bedroom, the strange man, the betrayal. The silence in the room became heavy. Then Frank slowly stood up. His voice trembled with anger. Funke. Mrs. Funky stepped back. I can explain, she said quickly. But Frank's voice became louder. Explain what? The house felt like it was shaking with tension. Nene stood quietly beside the sofa. Her father's world had just been broken. Frank stood in the middle of the room, holding Nene's phone tightly in his hand. His face was pale with shock and anger. Mrs. Funky's eyes moved quickly from Frank to Nene. I can explain, she repeated nervously. Frank looked at her slowly. Explain what? He said in a deep voice. Explain why another man was in my bed while I was away? Mrs. Funke opened her mouth, but no words came out. Frank lifted the phone again. The video was still playing. There was no mistake. Everything was clear. Nene watched her father carefully. She had never seen him this angry before. Frank, listen to me, Mrs. Funky said quickly. It is not what it looks like. Frank laughed bitterly. Not what it looks like? He said. You brought another man into my house, into my bedroom. Mrs. Funky tried to grab his arm. Please calm down. We can talk about this. Frank stepped away from her. Don't touch me, he said firmly. The room felt heavy with tension. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Frank turned to Nene. My daughter, he said softly. Thank you for telling me the truth. Mimi nodded quietly. I didn't want to hurt you, Daddy, she said. Frank sighed deeply. You didn't hurt me. The truth never hurts as much as betrayal. Mrs. Funke suddenly became angry. So you are going to believe her over me? She shouted. Frank looked at her in disbelief. I don't need to believe anyone. The video shows everything. Mrs. Funke's shoulders dropped. She realized she had been caught. Her voice became cold. Fine, she said. Yes, I brought someone here. Nene felt a chill run down her spine. Mrs. Funke continued speaking bitterly. I stayed in this house for years pretending to be a perfect wife, but I was tired of pretending. Frank shook his head slowly. I trusted you, he said sadly. Mrs. Funky laughed quietly. You trusted too easily. Frank took a deep breath. Then he walked toward the front door. He opened it and pointed outside. Leave this house, he said calmly. Mrs. Funky stared at him. You're serious? Frank nodded. Very serious. Mrs. Funky looked around the living room one last time. Her face was full of anger and embarrassment. You will regret this, she said. But Frank did not reply. After a moment, she picked up her bag and walked out of the house. The door closed behind her. The house became quiet again. Frank slowly sat down on the sofa. He looked tired and sad. Nene sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Frank gently held her hand. You are brave, Nene, he said softly. I was afraid, Nene admitted. I know, Frank said. He smiled weakly. But you protected our family. Tears filled Nene's eyes. Frank wiped them away gently. From now on, he said, this house will be peaceful again. Nene nodded. For the first time in a long while, the house felt calm. The truth had come out. The lies were gone. And father and daughter knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened in the future, they would always protect each other. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos.